One word, how most performance reviews go.
Yeah.
Terrible.
Oh, the dreaded performance review. If you're like most managers, you'd rather have dental surgery than do a performance review. You're not alone. Doing reviews can be time-consuming and require uncomfortable conversations that you'd rather avoid. Let's face it, some managers tiptoe around important topics, and employees often equate review time with a raise. In this episode, Dr. Jeff Kaplan and I break down how to do a performance review, what employees expect, and how to phrase some of your words so that you are prepared going into the dialogue. Hey, welcome back to the podcast, Jeff. Good to have you on again.
Good to see you too, Raj.
Well, today we're going to be talking about performance reviews. This is something that every company has to go through. Some enjoy doing it. Some have a great process. A lot of them, especially the smaller companies, don't have a full process in mind. They might know something that they had from a prior employer. So we've got several questions we're going to cover in today's conversation, and that is, when do you do performance reviews? How do most of them go? What are the kind of questions you need to ask? What kind of questions are people trying to get answered? And should you include pay raises with it, or should you separate it? And what's a good time in the year to do pay performance reviews? So that's a lot of stuff to unpack, but that's what we're going to cover today. Jeff, let's get started. We're in Q4 right now. Wow. Do most people do reviews in Q4? Do they wait?
Well, so it depends, right? So if they're on a calendar year, they may do it either approaching or more likely do it at the beginning of the year, right? Like you have to get your stuff in, and then because it's for the whole year, right? So it's usually at the beginning of the year. If you're in an academic calendar, right, then that's a whole different thing, right? Then you're getting it done in like July or August kind of thing.
Okay. All right. So a lot of that's dependent. And so let's say it's not academic calendar. Let's just presume a lot of people are looking at it from the business perspective. So performance review time coming up, right? So now when do you do it? Is it a December thing? Is it an October, November thing?
Well, again, so if it truly is, so it's 2022, right? So if you're doing performance review in 2022, first of all, you can tell, Raj, that you're an entrepreneur that runs your own business because you set policy, right? Right. So most people, particularly in medium, large companies, like it's the company policy. But the typical company policy is that it's for the full year, right? So, usually go on vacations, and then January, February, some folks even as late as March are doing the reviews, setting up meetings. Usually, like for example, the employee fills out a version that goes to the manager, then the manager fills something out, and then you have a conversation.
Okay. So some companies would already have that form that they would fill out. For those who may not have a form, maybe you could share some things that you've seen that are the most common useful things to have on a form that employee would fill out to submit before the
Yeah, I
review.
mean, one of the best is I like it when I see it, and I'm bummed when I don't, is that you have your business goals and then you have your sort of leadership development goals, right? So and they're both weighted, right? Meaning that they're both important if it's tied into, for example, for a bonus or in whatever way that you're going to be held accountable, right? So business goals are very specific, right? Let's say you want sales, right? So hit whatever 2 new market, whatever the goal is. And then you have the leadership goals. And then hopefully that's part of a discussion that you're having ongoing anyway with your employee, right? But leadership goal might be improving communication, right? Or even something as tactical as presentations.
Mm-hmm. Well, so now as a leader, almost everybody's going to have something tied to sales. CEO is definitely going to have something tied to revenue, and potentially growing markets and so on. What kinds of things do you see that people who are not in that part of the business have as some of their goals?
I mean, at tons. I mean, it's very specific to the job function, right? So I don't know, let's say you're in IT. First of all, there's a reflection. So it might be, update the software, right? So I think of a client that I worked with, one of his goals was he was redesigning for the entire large international organization, like the whole software platform, and then had to engage all the different very siloed entities to use that particular software, right? So it's just very specific to their function.
Okay. All right. So you've got on your thing that like, did you achieve these goals? What kind of narrative should an employee put down? Because usually there's an option to put stuff down also. And what kinds of things do leaders look for when they're reviewing employees?
Well, something just popped to my mind. It's probably only slightly answering your question, but that I highly recommend leaders, as soon as they kind of finish their performance review and the new year begins, to have an Excel spreadsheet that they open up and it's minimized on their computer all the time. And they add to it what they've accomplished throughout the year, right? When I do performance review trainings, I have a cartoon. It's great. It's cartoon characters of the boss and the employee, and the boss says, "Okay, I'm going to do your performance review. Ready, go." Right? Something like, like in the last 5 minutes, right? So, right, what happens is we get to that time of year, and then the boss and the employee are both sort of, struggling to think through the whole year, and ends up being top heavy with the last few months. So,
Yeah, yeah.
right.
I've seen that so many times. Okay, what did you do this year? That's the big question everybody wants to know in a performance review. And you just get the answers to the stuff you did the last few weeks, few months, because that's top of mind. And you forgot about something you did 11 months ago. And
Yeah,
so just, yeah.
yeah, and so much of it gets lost. I mean, so look, generally two types of managers in terms of performance reviews that I see. One is they avoid confrontation, so they just say, kind of exceeds expectations. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Doesn't really give any real feedback, right? And I have clients who want that feedback, right? They tell me, that's great. Tell me what I can improve on. Or then you have the employees that are just very hypercritical. I mean, they're managers that are hypercritical. And then
Mm.
the employee finds themselves having to defend what they've done. Like, wow, this is highly colored to this one small miscommunication that happened 2.5 months ago, but yet it's taking up 85% of the darn review, right? So if you've been tracking your accomplishments and and different aspects, particularly related to whatever the areas are in the review throughout the whole year, you sort of come ready to go.
And I like having that spreadsheet that's just open. It is done year round. So every time you do something, every single week or month, whenever you're doing something, you add to that spreadsheet so you can document not just what you did, but I would also have some sort of a narrative about the impact and what
Yes.
that meant for the
Yes.
company, because that's something that you don't want forgotten, because
Yeah, well, and then there's that how, right? So I was thinking in particular, right? So, Jamie, your peer, has been real problematic, right? And so you might even jot a couple of notes in your own little comment section. Won't get transferred per se on the, but like what you did to try to truly collaborate, because your success, is even more so these days, is contingent on other people working with you. Some are play nicely in the sandbox and some don't, right? So just kind of taking note, particularly when there's kind of issues that you've had to work through.
and this is the kind of thing basically what we're saying is keep a diary.
Yeah.
Right? Keep a diary, keep a journal of stuff that's going on in the company, what you're doing, what you're accomplishing, and stuff that you've had to deal with, just so that those are conversation starters in the performance review time. And as a leader, I think leaders should actually recommend to their teams that they do this. Make a spreadsheet, make a diary, so that we can discuss it definitely at the end of the year, but more than likely, maybe even a little bit sooner, maybe quarterly or something like that, just so that they can keep on top of things. So how do most performance reviews go? Now, you talked about the manager who does not want to be confrontational, so they just kind of give them exceeds expectations, meets all that,
Yeah,
all the great
basically.
reviews, and the employee doesn't actually have a true sense of where they stand. And we've seen situations, I think we've all read about it, where somebody thinks that they're doing well and suddenly they're terminated.
Yeah, yeah,
And
absolutely. They get a new manager who actually holds them accountable.
yeah, right, yeah.
So,
So
so
yeah,
can I
what
just
is
answer in one word how most performance reviews go?
yeah,
Terrible. And it goes
that's
terrible
true.
so here's the main
Yeah.
terrible from the manager side, and I'll tell you the main terrible from the coachee side, of the employee side. From the manager side, it goes terrible. Sort of you're hitting the nail on the head, but they're doing a lot of talking at the employee rather than engaging in dialogue with the employee. And look, let's face it, doing performance reviews is an art and a skill of which managers generally don't get training on.
That's correct.
Right.
That's correct. Yeah. Very few ever get training on it, so,
and they're usually not good at it. Just because it's because it's not from the employee side, it gets bad because, for example, there might be 97% of the review that's extremely positive, and they go right to that thing that's not like perfect, and they freak out, right? And so they over personalize the critical feedback, which, by the way, goes to show you why some managers avoid giving critical feedback in the first place.
Well, like if you're going to go buy some product on Amazon and you take a look at the reviews and it's got 4.5 stars, you go to the 1-star reviews to figure out what are people saying. Why did they not like it, right? And so even though it's got more positive reviews than negative ones, it's almost human nature to do something like this. So we gravitate to what the negatives about us are being said. So what's the better way to do this? What's the better way that managers can actually do reviews?
So one is engage in a dialogue and hopefully doing it throughout the year, right? So what I would say is that you're getting really clear, right? So the more specific and measurable and obviously actionable that the goals are, particularly around the business side, the safer you will be, right? So minimally quarterly, you're having a conversation, you're pulling out, like, if the review were today, right? A lot of folks do it semi-annually. Now, again, it's a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of time. So I suggest that there are companies now that they don't even do performance reviews. They just have coaching conversations throughout the year. But somewhere in between is to just make sure that you're having continued dialogue around their performance, what's working, what's not working, what would you like to see differently? And then their goals. So the way that I would say that the leadership development or the kind of personal professional development side of that conversation is the manager should be asking a lot of questions and listening versus doing a lot of talking at. So how do you think you're doing in communication? Can you think of an example of a time where you felt like you did really well? What did you do around that? Where do you feel that you've grown? Where do you think you still struggle? What about like 3 months ago when you had that conflict with Jane? Like, to talk through that. What did you learn from that? Right. So moving forward, when we look at goals for next year, what would be moving the needle even further around your development around communication?
I love the way you phrase that. And that's such a nice conversation. It's very professional. It gets the job done. And it also makes the employee feel like they're participating and not just being talked at. You said something interesting earlier, though. You said a lot of people are moving away from an annual performance review to just do regular coaching sessions. Talk to me about that. What does that mean?
Yeah, it means that they're very progressive, right? And it's a very scary world, right? Because, like, how are we going to hold accountable, right? And it kind of goes back to you. Do you trust, develop, support, and yes, and find ways to hold your leaders accountable or not? So what it means is that so a lot of times when you see managers and employees having the one-on-one meetings, it's always about the business. It's always about the business. They're going right to business items. I don't even say like hello. I didn't even say like, how was your week? Or, how you doing? Like, you were sick or you just got back from Jamaica. Like, talk to me, right? But anyway, and then they give the business goals and they never talk about their development, right? And so using the example earlier around, for example, communication, right? It should be like, I always say, like, 5, 10, 15 minutes of, say, 45-minute, conversation should be just around their development. So it sounds like open-ended coach-like questions, right? So, you had said that you wanted to hold yourself accountable this week for improving relationships with your peers at these 2 business units. Tell me about that. Like, what did you learn, right? And then just talking through it, having them give you real situations where they either struggled or where they did well, and then unpacking for them a learning opportunity.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times employees will possibly because of past experiences, associate a pay raise with a performance review. And they're not necessarily connected, or, I found that sometimes they shouldn't be connected, that the performance review is just like, hey, here's the coaching conversations. How do you separate that for companies who always tie, I won't say year-end bonuses because that might be different than an actual salary increase, but how do you separate a performance review from a salary increase, or should they be connected?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, so a lot of companies are structured. I know you don't want to talk about this, but like from a bonus perspective, right? And the higher you go in the leadership chain, the more that is all
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
the company's success, right?
Mhm.
One of the things I would say around this is I think the principle is around incentive, right? So the whole purpose of raises that aren't routine, right? So some organizations it's 3%, it's cost of living or 3% every year, right? Like that's just what it is. Others, it's like, hey, it's been 10 years, maybe time for a review of my scope of responsibilities that have changed. And, like, is it not time for me to be making a lot more than I was 10 years ago when you hired me?
Yeah.
Right. So there's that. But if you're incentivizing folks from a pay perspective, the reason, to your point, why you want to separate that out from a performance review is a performance review should be around the person's development. Do you work in a gotcha organization, or do you work in a supportive, challenging, growing, developing organization? And if it's the latter, then you definitely you separate them out.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so those are some really good key points here. Do you find that people, what do you find are the biggest stumbling blocks during a conversation? As you pointed out very aptly, managers are not really trained to do performance reviews. Oftentimes, the executives just say, "Okay, well, you're in management. You're managing these 4 people. Time to do performance reviews. It's due by the 20th of the month, get it back to me." So then they just start like running with it, but they don't actually know what to, those kind of conversations. So I love the way you described questions to ask during that conversation. Where do people really just get stuck? Like what happens that causes the conversation not to go so well?
Well, one is lack of preparation on both sides.
Hmm.
Right. So we talked about what the employee can do to prepare, right, throughout the year.
Mhm.
But from the manager side too, again, it's like one of these things that gets to that point of time of year. And, particularly if they have way too many people reporting to them, right? It often feels like the homework assignment that they just want to get through, right? As versus an opportunity to really have an engaging conversation about someone's strengths, development opportunities, successes, failures, right? And really setting goals, achievable goals for the next year. So so you so you imagine a situation. It's 2:00, and it's time to have my performance review meeting. And by the way, another thing is they end up canceling them and not doing them. But and here we go, and it's like we all know that we're going to probably talk about this thing over here, right? And if you have that like tightness in your tummy, you're doing it wrong.
Mm.
Right? Either side, right? But there is a power dynamic, right? So you've got the manager who's responsible for your, in part responsible for your, trajectory in the organization, right? And so, whatever power dynamic you've got going on in your head anyway, like from your upbringing, that's going to play itself out as well.
I think you said something that I think a lot of people don't realize the impact of, which is canceling the meeting, because the employee is more than likely going to be a little bit nervous going into the meeting, because they're talking about them. And so if they get a note that just says, "Oh, can't make it, got to postpone it," that's one thing. And that just kind of causes a little bit more anxiety. Whereas if the manager said, "Look, I want to meet, I've got a conflict. Can we reschedule it for this specific day? I definitely want to meet. I'm really sorry that I had to have to reschedule." At least that gives the employee some kind of feeling like, okay, it's just a little warmer way of kind of rescheduling. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I think you should hold them like they should be fairly sacred, right? So it should be the threshold for having to reschedule should be fairly high, right? Because it does make a statement about how important you and your development are.
Right. Yeah.
But listen, I would say, one of the problems that I see that's consistent with performance reviews, as in many other things, if managers don't have a language, an approach, and a structure to do it, then they feel they lack confidence going into it. And then there's that avoidance mentality. But if they learn a language and an approach and a structure and have it like a solid structure and to do these reviews, then they're much more excited and confident to do them. And that will definitely filter down to the employee.
Can we just talk about that for a minute? Like, what would that be? What could that look like for a manager?
So, for example, one of the things that I do when I do these trainings is I take the organization's performance review competencies and I make a wheel out of them, right? So this is obviously the non-business part, right? And so let's say it's, I don't know, executive presence, communication, relationship management, timeliness, right? Depends on the level, right, of what you're going to see. But you take those, right? And then I would ask the employee to rate themselves on a scale, say like 1 to 10, on each of these, where 10 is like the best they could possibly do. Right now, if they have a normal rating system, like a 1 to 5, 1 to 3, then I would say rate yourself using that system, right? But then be prepared to talk about why you think that is. Now, at the front end, at the beginning, say, of the year, the manager should be really clear what a 10 looks like, or a 5 or a 3, right? The highest score, right? And again, the more clear and specific they are, right, that they can be, the better. And so then the manager is also doing the wheel for the employee. And then they come together and they go through each other's wheel and talk about why you think it's a 3, why I think it's a 4, kind of thing. And then you sort of negotiate what that looks like and then come up with for goals for the next year.
So this would also be the structure and the language that they have to actually do that type of review.
Correct. And the approach, again, is it's a lot of inquisitive, asking questions, starting with the employee. Where do you think you are with this, right? And why do you think that is? And again, they often, particularly in the larger companies, they do start, that have like a full HR department, they do start with a form, right? The employee fills out a form. Now, some of these forms are populated early on, right? So the business goals are already there. And then when it's time to fill it out, it's sort of downloaded. But again, I think the more that you provide direction, I would say even training and support, but for folks on how to do these coaching conversations with these employee performance reviews, the better.
So I got one last question for you here on this topic. So sometimes people have been managing a group for years, and so they look at the same text that was written the previous year with just a few updates for this year and a few updates for next year, and nothing really changed. How do you move that? Because to really have progress, you can't just use the same words year to year, right?
Well, if that's it, I'd say throw out the darn the piece of paper,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
and, and switch it up, right? Like what I would say is, do a little pilot, right? So I would say anybody who's got the authority to make some kind of change, maybe looking at your own department, again, you might have some responsibilities from an HR perspective, even if you're the CEO, but do a little pilot and just try to find a way to make this more of a dialogue and a conversation than a check off, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But listen, but if the organization is more of a, you need to check this box, then I get it, right? Then I would say make that as easy as possible, right? Go ahead and, front load, last year's and make the changes, right? But still make sure that you're having those coaching conversations that are really going to impact their actual development.
All right. I think that's the most important takeaway from this conversation is don't just wait for that one time in the year that you have this conversation, have it throughout the year. In fact, one of the things I do with team members is every quarter I try to sit down with them and just have a dream session about where we could take their life, not just their career, within the company. And the question that I typically will ask, and I ask it in a very specific way, it's, let's say you and I are having lunch in 10 years. Tell me about what we're talking about. What's happened in your life? And the reason I picked 10 years, it's so far out that they don't have to feel like, oh, I got to say an answer that shows that I'm still with the company, because 10 years out, the manager may not be with the company either, right? So it gives them that freedom. And the other thing it does is 10 years, because it's so far out, allows them to dream, and it doesn't allow them to be anchored to what can I accomplish in the next 12 months. But what you can do when someone says, I want to be a CMO of a mid-tier software development company, you can then start working backwards and say, well, what can we do to help you add this? Well, first of all, what are the skills do you think you need to acquire to get there? And then what can we do inside our company to get you there? And I find that those conversations are so much better for performance than just your standard, okay, what'd you do? Let's rate you on a scale of 1 to 10 and that kind of stuff.
Well, it's a lot more motivating, right? But I would say too, then, because it's annual review, then after you do the 10-year conversation, say, okay, so a year from now, we're sitting here and we're having this dialogue. What do you want to be saying about communication? What do you want to be saying about these business goals, right? What clarity, like, do we need to come up with now so that it's pretty smooth a year from now?
Yeah, and the beauty of that approach is that actually helps you identify the individual goals for that person for tracking next year's performance.
Exactly.
Right. Great conversation, Jeff.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I hope our listeners got a little bit out of how to do these performance reviews and how to make them really impactful for your business. Thanks again, Jeff.